Americans tend to be somewhat suspicious of government. King George is still a tyrant. I mean, it's been 250 years, but King George is still a tyrant. Some would argue that even at arriving at a completed United States Constitution was not just difficult, but almost didn't happen as the states argued with each other about what should be in it. We're constantly creating new laws, arguing about laws, reassessing old laws, challenging the laws that we've made. When the governor of New Mexico, just to bring it up to more modern times, when the governor of New Mexico told churches not to meet in person back in March, we stopped meeting for about 9 weeks. This was a difficult decision for me personally. Let me tell you why. My wife might mention to you at some point that I have kind of a obstinate, contrary nature. She might use the word "I'm a rebel," describing me. I don't like, just conforming for the sake of conformity. So when the government said, "You will do this," my almost first reaction was, "I will not," because that's who I am. And I've worked on that over time. I thought I turned it on. Now I've turned it on. There's the sign. All right. So, did you notice that little contrary? I thought I turned it on. I'll argue with anybody. So, was it right or wrong for us to shut down? Because my first thought was, I must obey God rather than man. But the more that I reasoned about it, I asked myself the question of whether the government was oppressing us as a church. Were they persecuting us, or was this a health measure that they were asking us to be a part of for, safety at this time? Eventually, I got around to the latter decision that, according to them, this would be the right decision for that period of time. But as soon as we had the opportunity to meet again, wanted to do it, wanted to be a part of it. We've been studying from Romans, the 12th chapter, and it tells us in that passage that we are not to be conformed to the world. And one of the ways that sometimes Americans conform to the world is that sense of rebelliousness, of opposition to the things that we're told to do. And Jesus tells us to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And by the time that we get to the 13th chapter, he has this instruction for us. Romans 13, beginning in verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So we're going to spend just a few moments breaking down a little bit about what Paul says in this passage. And the first is that he says that all the authorities, the governments that exist, receive their authority from God. Authority means the right to rule. It's the power that God has given to them. As we studied in Ken's class this morning, all authority and power are in the hands of God, but on this earth he has given to the governments some of that ruling authority to do those things. Now you'll notice that he tells us several things about these governments, these authorities. The first is that the governments are instituted by God. They exist because he wants them to. He tells us in verse 2 that God has appointed them. So they have their place in God's plan. And the third thing he tells them is that government is God's servant. And by that, the focus is on that God uses the government to accomplish what his will is. They serve him. I think we all understand that this is ideally the way that things should be, right? But I want you to notice something interesting that I hadn't noticed my whole life, and maybe it's a difference in translation, or I'm growing up a little bit, but did you notice in verse 4 twice when he talks about being God's servant, it says, for he is God's servant. It's specific to the individual. And as I think about it, a lot of times when I think about our government, I think in terms of an organization, the government. But God says he. We're dealing with people. And it's these people who are God's servants, not just the government in a general way. Now, as I read these verses, Paul writes them to the Romans who lived under the rule of the Roman government. What was the Roman government like at the time of Paul? They had emperors, men like Caligula and Nero. And when we think about men like that, we think of not only morally perverse people, but rulers that were not the best. They weren't great people. But Paul, he doesn't make any distinctions about whether the government is an empire or a monarchy, a democracy or a republic, socialist or communist. He doesn't make any of those distinctions. He says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. So, whatever your governing authority is, what is our job? We have to be subject to it. Does that include cruel governments, evil governments, bad governments, corrupt governments? I'm going to use a different passage to give you my answer, why my answer is yes, that it includes all those things. It's in 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter. In 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter, and in verse 18, Paul writes to those slaves who are also Christians, and he gives them this instruction. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. So the principle that he lays out to these Christians is that if you're a servant, you have a responsibility to your master, and that is you be subject to them. But wait, my master beats me. He's cruel. He makes me do unspeakable things. Paul doesn't say, as long as your master's a good guy, then be subject to him. He says, even to the ones who are unjust, you be subject to that master. I can't imagine how that must have felt to hear that as a slave at that time, as a servant. How difficult that must have been to, be told. It doesn't matter what your master is, who your master is. Your job is to be subject to them. So my question is, does that same principle apply in Romans 13? When he says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities? And my answer is, Yes, I see a principle there. It's not about the governing authorities, because as Paul has pointed out, the governing authority was instituted by God, appointed by God, and it is God's servant. He is God's servant. Let me correct that. He is God's servant in these things. So Paul doesn't give us exemptions about how a disciple responds to different types of government. What does he tell us to do? He tells us to be subject to those governments. Subject means to put yourself under their authority. They have the authority, I'm under it. I have to do the things that the government tells me to do. Again, he's going to give us 3 reasons why we are to do that. If we do what is good, he says in verse 3, we will have his approval. So the government is there, and as long as you're doing what it says, shouldn't be a problem. The second thing he says in verse 5 is that you need to be subject not only to avoid God's wrath. It's an interesting thing he points out here, that being subject to the government is important to avoid God's wrath. Now, why would God be wrathful if I don't obey my government? And the answer goes back to he instituted the government. He appointed it. It is God. He is God's servant. And so if you don't follow, that's you're despising not just the government, but God. The other thing he points out in verse 5, he says, not just to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. And maybe this one hits harder for me than the other in some ways. Just that my conscience should tell me that if I've put myself in submission to a governmental power, my conscience should say, I'm going to do what they tell me to do. That's hard. The contrast that he gives us is not just be subject, but don't resist. Don't resist the government. So this tells me that I'm either subject to the government or I'm resisting the government. The word that he uses for resist is a military term of an army that's arrayed against some kind of enemy. And so when he says resist, it means to be in opposition to the government that exists at that time, to be adverse to them. And again, he gives us some reasons why we should not resist. In verse 2, when you resist, you're resisting what God has appointed. And that's, again, you're resisting essentially God in that case then. In verse 2, he also says, you're going to face judgment. Whose judgment will we face? Will we face the judgment of the government? Depends on the government, but most likely, yeah, that's going to happen. But are you going to face God's judgment? That's clear also, because as we just saw, he talks about you'll avoid God's wrath if you are subject. So the answer is yes, as far as those things go. But you'll incur judgment if you resist the government. And then in verses 3 and 4, he makes the argument that we should be afraid if we're doing that which is evil, if we're resisting the government. He says in verse 4 that rulers are not a terror to good, but to bad. We'll explore that briefly a little bit more in a moment. But in essence, he goes on in verse 5 and says, if you do wrong, then you should be afraid. And he tells us why. The government does not bear the sword in vain. Again, he doesn't bear the sword in vain. In other words, he has the right to execute judgment. He's an avenger of God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So, if you're doing what's wrong, they're doing God's will when you receive punishment for rebelling against them. So the concern with the beginning of verse 3, where he says, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. The concern is, what happens if I'm doing good, but the authorities are so corrupt or evil that they're punishing me unjustly? Should I be afraid then? We're going to explore that with looking at Jesus. Because Jesus did good, never did anything wrong. Was the government a terror to Jesus? Was he afraid of that government? I think we know the answer. So this passage presents for us these two possibilities. What will you do? Will you be subject to the authorities, or will you resist? So of course, our easy response is, I will be subject because that's what God tells me to do. But what is the reality in our lives when it comes to our struggles with our government? Don't you think that Paul infers that maybe these Romans even had a little bit of struggle with this? Did you notice in verse 6, he goes on to say, for because of this you also pay taxes. I don't know anyone who likes paying taxes. You know, there was a while when you could order online and avoid sales tax. And some people ordered online just because they could avoid the sales tax. They didn't want to pay their taxes. There was a big uprising about having to pay those taxes when everything changed. What does this passage tell us? The reason that you pay your taxes is because God has given these men this authority. The authorities, he says, are ministers of God. Paying taxes provides the funds for the ministers of God to do their job. So if you aren't paying your taxes, are you impeding God's servant? It's not just that the government wants to take my money, but they need my money to do what God has told them to do. So I have a responsibility to do it. We're going to look at 3 examples then of this idea of be subject to the government versus resisting. The first one, mostly from John, the 18th chapter, verse 19. 18th chapter and 19th chapter is the arrest and the trial of Jesus. So Jesus, of course, on Mount Gethsemane, in Gethsemane, the garden, and it's the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane. So Jesus is there with his disciples, except one who comes a little late and accompanied with soldiers. Judas joins them there, kisses him on the cheek, and Jesus asks the soldiers, who do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus says, I'm he. And the soldiers back off, which is just astonishing that they're the ones that fall to the ground. He says again to them, whom do you seek? Jesus of Nazareth. I told you I'm him. Jesus allowed himself to be arrested. He didn't resist it. Was this arrest unfair? Yes, but he didn't resist it. In fact, if you look in verse 10, what does Simon Peter do? As that is happening, and he's saying, I'm the one that you seek, let these other people go. Peter draws the sword, hacks at a guy's ear. What does Jesus say? Put your sword away. Not only did Jesus not resist the arrest, he told Peter not to. Was Jesus being subject to the government at that point? I believe he was. He goes before the leaders. You can read this in verse 22 of John 18. And one of the officers in the court strikes Jesus across the face for the things that he said to the high priest. And asks him, is this how you answer the high priest? And Jesus says, if what I said was wrong, bear witness. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? I'll tell you why this, got my attention as I was thinking about this is Jesus didn't strike him back. And man, could Jesus have struck him back? Right? All the power that Jesus has. I mean, when that guy slaps him, Jesus could have done some things. I would have been tempted to do some things to show them who I was. Jesus tells them, if I'm wrong, tell me. If I'm right, why did you do it? He doesn't strike back. He goes before Pilate, and that's where they have the conversation about being the king, which is a significant conversation concerning this idea of being subject to authorities, isn't it? Pilate asked them, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "Who gave you? Where did you get that idea to ask that question?" He says, I'm not a Jew. Pilate says, "I'm not a Jew." And Jesus says, verse 36, actually, let's take a moment to read this one. John 18, verse 36. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." If it was about a worldly kingdom, what did Jesus say his servants would have done? Peter was right to pull up that sword if it was just an earthly kingdom. Peter was doing the right thing if it was just an earthly kingdom to pull out that sword and start fighting back. But Jesus says, that's not my kingdom. The implication, of course, is, yes, I am a king. I have a kingdom, but it's not of this world. And we're not going to fight it in a worldly way. We're not going to fight for it in a worldly way. Did Jesus submit himself to the government? The conversation continues in verse 37. Pilate comes back and says, "So are you a king?" He says, "You say I'm a king. For that purpose I've come into the world to bear witness." So still arguing about the king. And then we get down to chapter 19, verses 10 and 11. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Now, what do we know about what Pilate had already decided about Jesus by this time? Pilate already knew Jesus was innocent, and he tried to find ways to let him go and keep the crowds happy. None of that worked. So here's Pilate saying, "Look, I've got authority. I can let you go, or I can kill you." What would you have said? At that moment, you're Jesus. What would you have said? It wouldn't have been what Jesus said. What Jesus said to him is, "You have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above." It fits exactly with what Paul had said, doesn't it? Jesus, even at that point, subjected himself to the government. And he did it because he had a great purpose. What was his purpose? Our salvation. But what an example he shows us also of how we deal with the governments. That we can subject ourselves to them. We don't have to be rebellious. Let's look in Acts the 5th chapter at another example. This is the example of John and Peter when they are arrested. We can start reading about it in Acts the 5th chapter and verse 17, where they've already been told once not to teach. But they've kept teaching, and they're healing people, and the high priest and all of the people in the government become jealous, and they are filled with jealousy, and we read in verse 18, they arrested the apostles and put them in the public prison. Again, I want to point out that we don't read anywhere in here that the apostles resisted the arrest. They didn't. They were arrested. They went to the prison. During the night, an angel of God comes and frees them, opens the prison doors and tells them to do what? Go out and teach. You go out into the temple and you keep teaching. That had been what they told not to do. But here the angel tells them to do it just like God had told them, Jesus had told them to do it before they left. So the next morning, they go out, they start teaching in the temple. The members of the government are getting ready to try them, and when it's time to bring them in, they're gone. And one man says, they're in the temple teaching. So in verse 26, an amazing thing happens. It says, the captain with all the officers went and brought them, but not by force, because they were afraid that people would stone them. Do you understand the significance of this? When they were re-arrested, it was not by force. They chose to obey the government. Even in being arrested, were they being arrested justly or unjustly? I guess it depends on which side of the wall you were on, right? Because the Pharisees and Sadducees would have said it was just because they disobeyed us. It didn't matter what we see that they did. Of course, when they're brought before them, they said, look, we told you not to do any more teaching. And Peter's response is, this is the one you've been waiting for the whole lesson so far, isn't it? We must obey God rather than men. And he meant that, didn't he? Why was that important? Why was it at this point that he could say to that government, I'm not going to obey you because I'm going to obey God? Because Jesus had told them to speak. Because the angel had told them to speak. They knew that this is what needed to be done so that the world could be saved. So they obeyed God rather than man. We see in verse 40 that this government has the disciples beaten. We don't hear any resistance still at that point. In fact, what we find out is they left rejoicing that they had suffered in that way. And also, in verse 42, the most important part is, they didn't cease teaching. It says, day to day and house to house and in the temple, they did not cease teaching and preaching Jesus Christ. So, did the apostles, were they subject to the authorities? Yes. As far as they could. When it came to the arrests, to the prison, to the beatings, they submitted to all those things. And no, they did not submit to the authorities because they kept teaching, because they must obey God rather than man. Last one that we're going to look at. Paul and Silas, Acts 16. Story that I think most of us are familiar with. They're in the city of Philippi. Paul heals a little girl that's possessed by a demon and is being used to gain money for some men. And of course, they're upset at the loss of money, and so they get a crowd together, and in Acts 16, verse 19, they drag them in the marketplace to the rulers there. And they say, these men are Jews, they're disturbing our city. The crowd joins in and is attacking them. They go to prison. They're beaten with rods, thrown in the inner prison. How much resistance did Paul and Silas put up to these people? Now, I'm not just talking about the crowds, the mob that did that. But when the government was beating them and putting them in prison, again, we see no opposition. We don't see them resisting. Of course, God does some incredible things, and they are freed and do some great teaching and help the Philippian jailer. But when the morning comes, an incredible thing happens. I want to read this part, beginning in verse 35. Acts 16, verse 35. But when it was day, the magistrate sent the police, saying, let those men go. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore, come out now and go in peace. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into the prison. And do they now throw us out of secretly? No. Let them come themselves and take us out. The police repeated these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. So they went out of the prison and visited Lydia. You realize that after the prison was opened with the great earthquake and they had taught the Philippian jailer and rejoiced, where did Paul and Silas go after all that was taken care of? They went back into the prison. Why? Because that's where the government had put them. They were submitting to the government even in that case. Can you imagine how that jailer must have been surprised by that attitude? I've never been in prison, but I don't think if I had a chance to be out, I'd want to be back in. Especially if I was where Paul and Silas had been told to be put. So now the government comes and says, you can let them go. You know, the threat of the riot's over, just let them go. Does Paul submit himself to the government when he says no? He makes a case, doesn't he? We're Roman citizens. We've been beaten publicly, we're uncondemned, and now you're going to throw us out secretly. In fact, he's asserting his rights, isn't he? His rights as a Roman citizen. But my question is still, did he submit himself to the government? Did someone say yes? Because I think that's the right answer. He was still submitting to them, even though he's asserting his rights, but he's not doing it in a way that resisting the government because he's in prison. So they come and they make the apology and they bring him out of prison. But Paul shows us what a powerful thing this is. Did Paul and Silas submit to the governing authorities? Yes. Did they stand for their rights in the proper setting and in the proper way? Yes. Did they resist the government? I think the answer is no. They didn't. So we have these passages. Let every person be subject to governing authorities, and we must obey God rather than men. These examples, these three, I think are very powerful to remind us that when we're doing God's will, even when we're opposed by the government, we must not resist the government. We must not be rebellious and violent. Jesus didn't do it. The apostles didn't do it. There's a way that it can be done. If there are consequences, we accept them. They took the beatings. They took the maltreatment. It doesn't mean that we agree with the government. It doesn't mean that we're admitting guilt, but we are being subject to the government. That's hard for me to say. There's a part of me that says, this is a hard lesson for me. It happened recently with the whole mask thing. Just to bring this around to a practical thing, theory versus reality. The theory that says, yes, I'm going to be subject to my government with my struggle to resist. When our governor mandated we stay at home unless necessary to go out, you have to keep 6 feet from people and you have to wear a mask, and that was common in the United States. You know, eventually they made the point there's medical exceptions and all that kind of thing, but you know, my first thought, knowing just a little bit of science that I know, is masks aren't going to help anything. The coronavirus is a lot smaller than the fabric in a mask. And so there's a part of me that just, wearing a mask is hooey. I mean, that's the way I thought of it. And so I didn't want to wear a mask. What struck my attention, though, is I wasn't the only one that felt that way. In fact, it was kind of worse than that. I heard many Christians who all my lives I had heard them say we need to be subject to the government. They were rebelling against wearing a mask. And I wanted to do that too. And I thought I had good reason Mine was pseudoscientific. Eventually, you'll notice I wear a mask when I'm out in public. Why do I do that? Is it because I came around to the fact that a piece of cloth was going to keep something that was a microorganism that could easily get through all those spaces? Was it because Nope, it's because the government said I was supposed to. And that's what it tells us in these passages. Those who often quoted, although some found a way around it. On the internet, you can still get this for for just $12.99. You can get this a religious exemption card that people have used to say, I don't have to wear a mask. And they use a civil rights law that was about racism to try to make the point that I don't have to wear a mask. This discussion is not about masks. It's about our struggle as Christians with resisting authority. Because I don't think I'm the only one who's a rebel. I don't think I'm the only one that struggles with it. I don't think I'm the only one that resists authority. Oh, I know. I've heard all the arguments. The government is overstepping its authority and making me wear a mask. This should be a personal liberty decision. Chances are I'd agree with you 9 times out of 10 on exactly that thought. But it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant because the government said you have to wear a mask. And so as a follower of Christ, I'm subject to that because this is not about I must obey God rather than man. This has nothing to do with, I can still teach people with a mask on my mouth. Some like it better. Brethren, we have to be careful about how we approach these things when it comes down to real life. Because I think too often we must obey God rather than man has been used as an excuse for rebellion. We give ourselves very wide open spaces in interpreting what is obedience to God in favor of what I want to do in opposition to what the government has said. So where do we draw our lines? The answer has to be that it's very carefully. I mean, Paul was really clear in his admonition in Romans 13 that we need to be concerned about the wrath of God if we're resisting. And that we need to do this for the sake of our conscience, to be subject to the government. So if we're going to use a passage like we must obey God rather than men to say I don't have to be subject to the government, we must be very clear about a specific passage from God that says this is what you need to be doing. Isn't that, after all, what the apostles had? When they said we must obey God rather than man, it's because Jesus said, you go out and teach. And they said, don't teach. Who are you going to obey? You obey God. But too often we find ways around that. We must always remember that God gave these institutions, these people, He appointed them, He instituted them. They are His servants of God. Even if they're wicked, even if I disagree with them, they have this role. So submit. Do not resist. Keep looking at these examples. I mean, you can go back. You can look at Daniel. Go back to the book of Daniel and read all the times with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and various times throughout that story, you'll see them submitting to the government and only resisting when it was about God. It's an incredible thing. All right, so no more little rebels. Let's be people who are subject to Him, because this is what God has given us, and He's given it to us for our good. If you need our prayers and help this morning, if you're here and not a Christian, I know we haven't talked about this today, but Jesus has a way of salvation for whatever sins you've committed. If you've done things that are wrong, those sins can be washed away. Believe that Jesus is the Christ. Repent of your sins, be baptized. If you have that desire, come forward as we stand and sing.
Have you been to